Adam. As Adam just introduced me, I'm Kimber Wilkerson, and I have my background and sort of most of my major research interests are in working with kids with social and emotional behavioral problems, behavioral disorders, and so I've done a lot of work in the terms of promoting literacy for adolescents with emotional behavioral needs. And so some of that work necessarily or coincidentally involves technology. So for today's presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the issues around promoting literacy for adolescents, and then I'll try to highlight the technology portions of that. I also invited Carly Roberts to come and present with me. Carly is actually the doctoral student. She's a first-year doctoral student who just moved here from Alaska this year, and she is working with Melinda Lico, who does a lot of work in literacy and professional development. But Carly has been doing some investigation of reading interventions and literacy development for kids with significant disabilities, significant cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities. So I asked her to come and present with me because I knew that folks here had a specific interest in interventions for kids with intellectual disabilities or significant disabilities. So I tried to accommodate that. And she's also done some work with her, with Melinda Lico, on System 44, which is another technology-based literacy kind of intervention. So I asked her to highlight that as well. This is what we'll, So I'm going to do just a few minutes of why focusing on adolescent literacy. Probably as whenever you're talking to educators, there's not usually a need to rally people around that idea. But I'll spend a couple minutes talking about that and just highlighting some elements of, sort of outcomes for kids with disabilities around the area of literacy. And I'll talk some about important elements of literacy instruction that have been highlighted by other research. It's been an area of increasing interest in the last maybe 5 or so years. And then I'll talk about reading instruction for struggling adolescent readers in the state of Wisconsin. In the last year with one of my doctoral students, we did a survey of all the high schools in the state of Wisconsin. And so I'll share those, some of those highlights of some of those results with you in terms of what people are doing out in those high schools right now. A lot of that ended up being Read 180. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then Carly will talk more specifically about that subgroup of students with significant intellectual cognitive disabilities and System 44. So in general, kids with disabilities, not surprisingly, have lower rates of proficiency in reading and language arts than their peers without disabilities. These are some general statistics about adolescent readers. So even for kids in high school, there are still 27% of kids without disabilities who are not reading at the proficient level. The next slide, this is federal, and only 35% read at or above the proficient level. This next slide is actually Wisconsin, so I'm imagining that most of you are familiar with some of these kinds of statistics, but when I'm talking about adolescents, I kind of lump the middle school up through high school in here. So I have some summary statistics for 8th grade and 10th grade in Wisconsin, and as you can see on both the NAEP, the national assessment, as well as the WKCE, students with disabilities who are performing below basic, so kids who really need to focus some, I would call those struggling adolescent readers. There's 73% of kids with disabilities on the NAEP, faring better on the WKCE, but still lagging behind their peers without disabilities. And then in 10th grade, we only have the WKCE data, and you can see that 35% of students with disabilities in Wisconsin were below the basic level compared to only 5% of their peers. And again, this is the part I'll just kind of slip through quickly. Obviously, reading is a key skill that correlates with lots of other important long-term outcomes like school completion, which also correlates with employment. Lots of demands of employment that require lots of literacy skills, including some very specific literacy skills, and of course, post-secondary school attendance. These things are all related to reading. And when I was talking a little bit ago about, there's been an increased interest in the needs of adolescent readers specifically. So back about 10 years ago, the National Reading Panel report was issued. So that was something that was a very comprehensive review of reading interventions that focused around 5 core areas of reading. And that was not addressing the needs of adolescent readers specifically. It was really looking at early reading or beginning reading. And so sometimes you could kind of extrapolate up from that, but there was some criticism of doing that because a lot of the research in the National Reading Panel report was on kids around the third grade level, so early readers, beginning readers. And so how well that actually, the recommendations from that panel actually apply to kids who are struggling at age 15 was under question. So since then, there's been several other reports that are looking just at adolescent literacy, like Reading Next, and then some reports from different centers that have come out in the last, let's say, 10 years. And of these reports, so some of them have unique, there's several other reports too, but a lot of those just summarize the findings from these main reports. Reading Next specifically is one that's referenced a lot. But across them, there's some common themes in terms of recommendations. So what I called here effective practices are things that came out across all of those major reports about adolescent readers, promoting adolescent readers. So some of the things are similar to the same kinds of reports for early beginning readers, like providing direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction, increasing student motivation and engagement in reading. And this is something that gets a lot more attention for adolescents, this idea of needing to increase their motivation to want to do these other things, right? So sometimes, and anecdotally, you'll have teachers and educators talk about sometimes the strategies that we think work for struggling readers, or we call them struggling when they're adolescents, early readers when they're younger, don't necessarily work if the kids aren't kind of invested in the process as well. So a lot more attention to motivation, so I'll come back to that as well. Another thing that's highlighted for adolescents more than for younger kids is the importance of incorporating technology into instruction. And so sometimes that is done as a motivator. Sometimes it's, I think that's more of a simplistic kind of way to incorporate technology, the idea that just the use of some kind of technology will be motivating to kids. But also there's some research to suggest that if we can use technology in more authentic ways to help kids with reading tasks, so there's some importance in sort of thinking about the literacy kinds of activities that adolescents would naturally be engaged in, and how much of that is kind of technology reliant these days, as well as teaching kids to use technology as a skill by itself and encouraging literacy through the use of those tools, as opposed to just saying, isn't it fun to use this computer program, right? Because that sometimes wears off. So there are more sophisticated ways to think about the incorporation of technology. Intensive and individualized interventions by specialists. So this is kind of summarized. These words aren't directly pulled from any one report, but it's something that comes up across many reports. And what I always think of when I see this suggestion is, oh yeah, we still need special ed teachers, right? Yeah, but I think that's what that one means to me. So there's still some suggestion that there are kids who need some kind of individualized support and instruction from people, whether they're reading specialists or special educators who have some expertise in some kind of instruction. Mm-hmm.
This might relate to your second point of your motivation. I'm just curious to know about how content plays in here. In other words, in identifying interest areas, whether through technology or, and maybe even more specifically through technology and how content areas, because I think my impression is maybe some of that has changed, that there's probably a chance that kids are more interested in other things now than they were several years ago because of technology.
Oh, okay, so maybe that allowing sort of greater access to information and content might help naturally widen kids' interests in topics. Certainly access to information, it's interesting. I thought when you first started asking, I was just thinking about a lot of times for adolescents, a lot of the literacy tasks that we expose them to are really related to expository, factual kind of information. So a lot of the things that we do with younger kids to think like, oh, the love of reading, are things around narrative tasks. And so we have this different kind of influence. And with the adolescents, there's more of an emphasis on content instruction, factual information, learning for recall, different kinds of things. But that's an interesting hypothesis, and I can't think offhand of any research, any of these reports that kind of acknowledge that in a direct way. But I will say there are some projects that have been looking at kids' access, increasing access to material more in a universal design kind of framework. So if we can kind of get past the text-heavy way of giving kids information and come up with ways to, lots of websites you can click and it reads it out loud to you. There's lots of ways to access content and increase your content knowledge without struggling through the, the words on the page. I think, and that's one of the things I would say from a universal design perspective, and we actually had someone speaking to our department maybe a week ago about this, is the idea of kind of sort of getting away of, does it always have to mean literally reading the words on the page, or can we focus on comprehension, and sort of use technology to help people around the act of sounding out those words, but focus more on this.
Are you going to go more in depth on each one of these, or?
I am going,
No, that's the question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Do you have a listing of what is the best technology to support reading instruction? Did you find that in the findings or in the effective practices?
Yeah.
What is the, technology
The
is all the
best.
way from,
right.
I don't know, the pen could be considered
Right,
some
right.
technology. But, what are the technologies that support reading instruction the best?
And I have some guidelines for you, but not like, there's not an answer. So in Wisconsin, the most popular kind of one type of technology that is used for adolescents is Read 180 as a curriculum.
Okay, so that's to support reading instruction.
Yes.
And so then the debate amongst the reading instruction purists is there still needs to be reading instruction even though you're a 9th, 10th grader, instead of using the software product that will read it to you,
Right.
because we're going to make sure you can read someday,
Yeah.
kind of like the math calculator question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And so I'm not going to speak to that in the kind of detail that you would probably like, but I would say that personally, I try to thread those two lines of thought. I definitely am a proponent of accommodation use and sort of trying to think outside the box in terms of what demands we're placing on kids and not putting false kinds of roadblocks like you have to do. We're not going to let you think about those big ideas until you can pass this reading test, So certainly, but I also think on the other hand, and this comes from, my work more in the realm of kids with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders who have, who are low readers. I think that a lot of it is they've missed a lot of instruction. There's either through mobility or through being kicked out or being sent into programs that are credit recovery or focus on behavior, and for some reason they have been exempted from the demands of a lot of our kind of core curriculum, and so they get to be adolescents, and I think that I don't want to give people the out of saying, let's just give them the accommodation to get around their reading, because I think there are, for some kids, and there's some good evidence to show that even kids 15, 16, 17 years old who are reading at maybe first, second, third grade level can learn to read. Like you can actually teach those kids to read. And so, and that's not tied necessarily to technology, but just the idea of instruction, it's not necessarily too late, or it's not a lost cause. So I think for some kids it's just that they haven't had access to that instruction, really meaningful access. This is a tiny bit of a tangent, but so part of the work that I've done is in doing some reading instruction in juvenile correctional settings, and so there are kids there who are pretty low readers, and it is amazing to me. We have done some pretty intensive interventions. They're one-on-one, but in like maybe a 6-week period, kids will be making just leaps and bounds of gains in reading because they're there. Like, no truancy problem in corrections, and you are the most interesting thing going on. I just think, let's not let them off the hook that easily. Like, they, given the right kind of instructional setting, you can boost their skills. But, and I think Carly will talk a little bit more about maybe some of the kids you're maybe thinking about who, for whom there's been lots of struggle over time with some of those more basic skills. So anyway, that's my side. But
well, and then the struggle, of course, is if they're 15-year-old and they're sitting in a social studies class, which is a reading class, and we're withholding the support for them because we want them to learn to read. Meanwhile, they're getting an F in social studies, and then that transfers over to their other class that they go in. They can't read the manual, plus that gets them an F, so.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a bind. So so I think you might be interested in, I mean, it's just descriptive about what's going on
Okay.
in high schools, but it'll kind of highlight some of the tensions that
Thank you.
you're bringing up. Professional development. So, and I'm guessing that some of you have some role or voice in the kinds of professional development that teachers receive. And I'll come back to this specifically around kind of reading instruction. So obviously professional development is something that we say for everything, right? Like that helps all things, in schools. But I think there's some specific kinds of holes or problems that are crop up in high schools around reading for adolescents. And again, this is a summary of the recommendations made by all those reports. Okay, so these weren't generated by me, just summarized by me. That one I repeated myself. Explicit vocabulary instruction is another thing that people always bring up for adolescents. Using assessment to identify strengths and weaknesses of students on all those components of skills. Again, seems like kind of an obvious, an obvious point, but sometimes we forget about these things for older kids. And then opportunities for extended discussion of text. So whether that's narrative or expository, and as I pointed out, a lot of adolescents are maybe immersed more in